All right, here we go. Hello, everyone. My name is Josh, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of a deep dive into how I went about the iteration for my thesis game, Godwalker. This talk is titled "Scratching an Itch versus Itching a Scratch," and it's kind of gross sounding, but I think it'll make sense as I go. So let's jump right in. Thank you all for coming. So what is Godwalker? It's like a boomer shooter inspired FPS. It's like a first-person shooter that's super fast-paced. It's got some arcade and roguelike elements. It's my MFA thesis, and a lot of the mechanics in the game revolve around moving really, really fast. You know, you have to swap out your weapons to regain ammo. You can't reload. You also have this like big meter on the bottom of the screen that refills only when you deal damage and kill enemies, and then you can kind of go into this crazy, like, hardcore state called God Walking. And that's also the only way you regen health, so you have to play fast in order to succeed. So let's see how this was made. So what are we talking about here? We're going to be talking about a few different things, 3 major points, though. So backwards feeling first design, scratching an itch versus itching a scratch, which is the title of the talk, and all the ways that I've failed and how you can avoid them. Which I think is why everybody's really here. So let's start with sort of, conventional feeling design. So I think this is something that we're all familiar with. We have in school at least, this conventional way of thinking about games is like, oh, you're either a feeling first or a theme first or like a feeling first. And, if you're mechanics or systems first, then what you'll usually do is like, oh, I have this great idea for a card game. Let's build it around that, right? Or if you're theme first, then you'd say, let's make a game around zombies. Like, how do zombies act? What ways can we make zombies move? Like, that's a theme. And then you have feeling, which is like, I want the player to feel this way, right? Typically, when we do that, we know what we're looking for. If we want a player to feel sad, then we'll think about what mechanics we can use to make that player sad. So we say, I have this feeling, and here are the mechanics to capture it. Then we build and test prototypes with intent to see if the mechanics actually do give us the correct aesthetics, or we try new mechanics if those don't work. And then we go through this cycle over and over. So what happens if we don't know what we're looking for? This is backwards feeling design. This is sort of like an itch that we can't scratch, right? Like whenever we have like an itch on our arm or something, we don't know exactly where it is. We have to start scratching somewhere, and then eventually we recognize, oh, that's not the right place. It's a little to the left, and then we eventually find it, and we satisfy that itch, right? We satisfy that scratch. So I have this itch, and I can't pinpoint it. Did these mechanics scratch it? So you build and test, see if it works, and then you start over if it doesn't. And that's sort of the same cycle. It's very, very similar, but we'll kind of get into a little bit of how those differ. But the main idea is that instead of saying, I have this emotion that I want to capture, you sort of have this like, almost like if you've played a lot of games, you have this like gameplay experience in your head that you're looking for, right? And sometimes you just kind of come across a game and you're like, wow, I had no idea that's what I wanted. A beaver core city builder, that's awesome. I'm going to play the shit out of that. I love it. This is great. And you've satisfied this itch that you didn't know you had, which is sort of what I was feeling when I was beginning my thesis. I had this itch that I didn't really know I had. So itching a scratch equals sort of conventional feeling design. We can see the scratch on our arm. We say, that's where we last itched. We can itch it again, right? And you do that a lot of the time with conventional field design. If we play sad games, we can make a sad game, right? We know that because it's scratching our itch. But then scratching an itch without having a scratch is backwards feeling design. That's kind of what I'm calling it. I haven't really been able to find any terms on this, but we can feel the itch. It's harder to scratch because we can't see it. We have to kind of take shots in the dark, and we have no comparisons to draw from. So we absolutely have to just start itching somewhere, right? We have to take that shot in the dark, and that's kind of what I did. I took a lot of shots in the dark. So there are 4 separate games we're going to sort of be discussing. The first 3 are going to be pretty interesting because I did a lot of stuff. And the third one there, you can see that I had a little bit of a time. You can probably tell at about what point in this timeline I had to lock in what I was making for my thesis, or when people started saying you can't keep experimenting. I think it's pretty obvious, but let's dive right in. So how do we start going backwards? We don't know what we're looking for, so we have to try and define the itch. We have to think like where on us is this itch, right? Like we have to take a shot in the dark, see if it scratches the itch. If it does, we keep building it. If If it doesn't, we start over and redefine the itch, and we go through this process over and over. And we'll talk about some kinks in this armor later and why this isn't a foolproof plan. But here's my first shot in the dark. I tried to define the itch. I had 3 major things. I wanted resource management, just like, I want to constantly be thinking about something other than just the action, right? In this case, in the top right, you can see that there are these rocks, and you break them, and you get ammo, and that's how it works. You break the rocks with ammo, you get more ammo, right? It's pretty simple. It's a little bit of a resource management, and then on the bottom right, you can see there are different kinds of rocks, which do different kinds of things. It's very simple. Discovery was another thing, just wanting to find new things in the world, right? That was a big thing, and shooting is fun, I guess. So I put shooting in, because action is cool. So how did it end up? I tried to scratch it. Resource management is cool, but this isn't good resource management. Ammo's a resource, but it's not fun to think about it, because if you don't want to run out of it, you have to keep collecting it, and then it just gets boring because you just shoot for a long time, and it's not really compelling. And then the same thing with the areas. The environments are cool, but they're not really compelling enough. They all kind of feel the same, and they don't really look that different, and it's not fun to explore the same thing over and over. And then shooting things is fun, but this combat isn't fun. So I had to actually, I really recognized, like, the enemies weren't great, the shooting wasn't great, but I didn't give it enough focus. I thought a lot more about the resources of the game. And another thing of note as well is that the resources that you're collecting, like the purple and yellow things that you see on the screen a little bit, you don't actually use them here. You use them at, like, a hub world. So did we scratch the itch? No, we did not scratch the itch. This is a game that you can play. It has a boss fight. It's fun, but it doesn't scratch the itch. It's not interesting. So I moved on. I did another shot in the dark. I said, okay, let's redefine the itch. Ammo sucks, but what if it was the player's power instead? Like, as you get more ammo, you get stronger. So now there's, like, an incentive. And then I put that ammo on the enemies. So you're killing the enemies to get more, like, power juice or whatever, and you get stronger. So it's a little bit more tied together. It's a little more interesting. The environments were empty, so let's add some indirect narrative. Let's make really giant robots that make you think, wow, this place is overgrown and these things are rusting and there was a war here. That's pretty cool. That's a cool setting to be in, this abandoned, like, area. And the action isn't fun, so I remade all the enemies and I remade all the arenas and I made a new player controller. So I just kind of put everything, I remade everything. I started over, basically, from scratch. So how'd that go? Power's interesting, but making it like an ammo thing that you constantly have to pick up isn't that interesting. The storytelling is cool. The environmental storytelling is really cool, but it's really disconnected from the map design. It's connected from the, like, enemies that you're fighting. You don't really care about it after a little while. There are a few cool moments where you run into really neat, perspectives of giant figures, but other than that, it's something I'll continue to do because I think it adds a lot to the world, but it didn't add enough to make me feel satisfied. It wasn't scratching that itch, right? Whatever it wasn't this. And action is really chaotic, but it's not really doing it for me. It just feels really chaotic and random and open and wide, and it doesn't really, as I'm playing, I don't really feel like it's scratching the itch that I want. So did we scratch the itch? No. Again, we didn't scratch the itch. The second game didn't scratch the itch either. So then I did another shot in the dark. So I said, okay, ammo and power, they're not interesting. What if the thing you're managing is the weapons you have and the abilities you have? That's pretty cool. That's pretty compelling. Now I'm discovering new things to interact with the world. So then I was saying, exploration in these big areas isn't cutting it. So what if I tied in the abilities and made exploration part of the combat? There you go. Now we have a Metroidvania, which was an awesome decision. And the action is too chaotic. So I kind of tried to make everything a little bit more tight and a little bit more intense. Like, you take more damage when you get hit. Enemies are more aggressive. They fire more things at you and not just at random, even though it looks a little random on the bottom right. But how'd it go? Yeah, weapons are really compelling. It's weapons and abilities when they're kind of bespoke and made individually, and there's lots of them that you interact with. It's pretty cool, and especially when those abilities tie into the world, right? You can see from on the bottom right, there's like an electric weapon that I got, and it lets you kind of hit this battery, and you can use that to get across areas. It's like, okay, cool. That's a Metroidvania mechanic. And it works, and it's fun, and you are looking for batteries, and then you find secrets. It's pretty neat. And the action is really intense. It's very close to what I want to make. I actually, when I made the first combat demo, I played it for 2 hours, and it was just the same room over and over with different abilities and weapons, and I felt really good about it. So did we scratch the itch? Yes, we did. We've done it. I've finished the talk. It's over. We don't need to look at anything else. Oh, okay. Well, yes, but there were a lot of issues with this, you know? So weapons and abilities are really compelling, but that design space is really huge and overwhelming. And as a solo developer, I can't really support that, you know? As somebody who's managing all the systems at once, it's going to be really difficult for me to say, let me spend a whole week on all of these different things, let me figure out how they're going to interact with the world. Like, even though that's the core of the game, I also have to worry about everything else, like enemies and art and environment design, just everything at once. So that kind of feeds into, you know, Metroidvanias are really cool and they tie the abilities in really well, but Metroidvanias do take a really long time to make, and I only have a few months, so I have to kind of take a step back and really say, like, what can I accomplish in this time? The action is like, it's really good. It's really good action. This whole game, this whole prototype, it's 45 minutes long. You can play it. It's really cool. I actually am really proud of this, but the problem is that it's not exactly what I want to make, right? It feels like something is missing, and I'm not sure what that is. So I took another shot in the dark. I said, fuck it, whatever. I got to take a step back. I got to redo what I'm doing. I have to continue thinking about this. So I redefined that itch one more time. I said that the design space is too big. So I was like, okay, forget the abilities. Let's just do weapons, and let's make the arenas even smaller, make the enemies even more aggressive, and just make all of the weapons orthogonally different. Like, make no weapon the same thing twice. And then I thought, okay, this can't be a Metroidvania. They take too long to make. I have 4 months. So one thing that I did look into is how, like, I've always been a fan of roguelikes, but roguelikes themselves let you sort of have this, you can make some content and then overlay that content. So, for example, if I make one map, but give the player, like, different weapon loadouts, that's a really good way to increase replayability, right? To make the game not just longer, but more compelling and more interesting. And I ditched this concept that I loved of exploration, which I had throughout all these other games, because it was just too much. So I focused on smaller discovery elements instead. And then I realized that I had kind of hit the nail on the head with what I thought the action was missing. You know, I went first person with the camera because I wanted to get more personal up in their face. It lets you, you know, maneuver through smaller spaces. It lets you deal more damage. You can be more precise. It feels like it's in your face more, and it feels faster, even though the player is actually going way slower. And I added in some neat mechanics to keep the player kind of moving, right? Like, you can't use the same weapon for too long. If it runs out of ammo, you have to switch. And then I have this meter on the bottom, which is like the Godwalker meter, where it fills every time that you deal damage, and this was the original version of it. It had 5 levels, and if you could maintain the 5th level, you could just be really, really strong, right? Which feels really good. It was a really successful playtest. I remember the first time that I actually playtested this with the roguelike mechanics of just having the player get different weapons as they move through rooms. I had people playing this game for like hours, and I was like shocked that that could happen, because if I'm being real, my previous prototypes I didn't think were that fun. They were technically really solid, but I didn't think they were that fun. So yeah, how'd it go? You know, drastically different weapons. They make the player play pretty differently. That's really cool. So now you've got this cool diversification where some players will pick, like, you know, sniper in the top right, or they'll pick a minigun, like in the bottom right, and you get these really interesting interactions. You know, the smaller arenas make the enemies matter more and make combat more intense. The roguelite elements actually did add a lot of replayability. I actually recently had the longest playtest ever where somebody played my game for 4 hours. I have never seen... That's crazy, you know, especially for something that is so early, which I thought was really, really interesting, and I learned a lot from it. And yeah, I mean, focusing entirely on weapons, maps, and enemies is like the 3 core concepts of the game that I really am going to be fleshing out and exploring, especially as I enter the content production phase. That's a huge deal, just having these 3 things that I'm focusing on. First person also just makes everything feel way more interesting. You know, contrary to what people would believe, the first person mode actually makes platforming way more fun in this game, especially because I rewrote the jump. and the movement, so that first-person movement actually feels a lot better. And then just the idea of hotness, so that your weapon, as you use it over time, it gets worse. You need to pick up a new one, right? The whole thing about killing enemies and getting more god juice so that you can stay in Godwalker longer. By reworking the mechanics more and more in different ways and sort of adjusting that tuning, I've managed to make this pretty interesting little zone that you fight in, and it's fast, it's cool. And they all push diversification and speed, which are some of my two biggest pillars. So did we scratch the itch? Yes, we did. We actually did it this time. We really did it this time. So that's what Godwalker went through. It took a long time to get to the point that it's at. And I'm pretty proud of it. I'm pretty happy of where it ended up. It took a long time to get here, and I had some trouble along the way for sure. And we did not touch on all 15 different games at all. I think that there are some in here. I actually left out a few from those 15. There's actually a few more. We'll kind of talk about those in a sec. So we're gonna get to the failures, which is, I think, the the part that everyone comes here for. So now, you guys don't have to fail. I'm gonna tell you, like, if you want to try this design flow out, if you want to kind of try and scratch that itch, this is sort of what you have to do. So this is a slide from earlier where I was talking about backwards feeling design, right? We don't know what we're looking for. We have this itch we can't pinpoint. Then we build or we start over. I'm gonna add just a little bit to that. We don't know what we're looking for. Ask yourself frequently, I have this itch I can't pinpoint. Do these mechanics scratch it? And you can start over at any time. I was bound by things like classes and due dates and proofs of concept and prototypes, so I couldn't start over. I couldn't say, okay, I'm not actually going to finish that. I'm going to reset, just because of the structure of how things work. But if you don't have those structures, you should just stop working on something if you feel like it's not doing it, right? Because what happens if you don't is you get this really bad scenario where you sort of start saying, maybe I can fix everything with a new player controller. And that's the Rockhopper player controller in the Mindroid map, or, a boss fight that I scrapped from Rockhopper, or a challenge mode from Praetor, which just made it so that you had to pick something bad each time. And then another challenge mode where I just put a bunch of guys in a room, or another boss fight, or a mode where you had 2 guns, which was really 4 guns, and you'd change between them using the scroll wheel. None of these ideas were good. You get one big fix and then you gotta move on. If you have more than one big fix, then you're failing, right? You're not gonna fail. Well, you're not gonna fail. You're gonna fail slowly. You gotta fail fast. So I've spent too much time on each iteration. The prototypes were rapid. I was making stuff really quickly, but the work was just wasteful, right? It wasn't working towards my goal. And if you're still making sweeping design changes and you're not itchy, then you got to take a step back. If you're making these big sweeping design changes and you're still like, oh, this itch is not being scratched, then you have to take a step back and sort of reevaluate your goals. And then you should know when a big fix is the right move. And I made these 2 columns of do it and don't it, where on the left we got to have these good things. Like, if the fix that you want to do just reinforces the thing in your game and makes it scratch that itch harder, then do it, right? If you've planned this fix ahead, then do it if you can safely test it, right? Just go for it. But don't it if you're simply adding the fix because you're like, oh, we have to patch this up and make it okay, just because if you're losing a lot of work, that's part of the process. You're going to have to throw out prototypes, right? Nothing has simply just gone from a prototype to final production. Or don't it if your game isn't fun, but you'll add this one thing and it will be, right? So it's really the difference between confidence and whether you're unsure. And that's all I've got for you today. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. If you want to connect, you can find me on any of these things here. I'm on all socials. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find my website online. It's just joshhirshfield.com. And I really appreciate all of y'all listening, and have a great rest of your GDC.